Stories about the life of this church, fragmented stories to be sure, but powerful nonetheless. And the stories of our Tiffany windows are certainly among those stories. What those windows commemorate, why Tiffany chose the scenes that they did, what it was like for the church to work with Tiffany Studios. But these stories are just some, as Catherine Spinella said, just some among the many that deserve telling and retelling. I'll touch on those topics of the windows, but we've put together a more linear discussion of it in this booklet, which, thank goodness, Michelle Sionis and the Christian Formation Committee have made available today. If you don't have a copy yet, please pick one up at the end. It's illustrated with images of original documents from the archives that help to tell the story of the windows. And Karen Ermler, is Karen? Yeah, there's Karen. Karen wanted me to make sure that we had the coloring book about the windows that was formed some years ago. She lent me her copy. I went down to Staples and made another 25 copies. So some of those are on the piano if you're not familiar with that. I think at the very least we ought to be putting copies of these in the activity booklets in the back so that as the kids gather in the pews on Sundays, they can color those but also relate them to the windows. We scheduled this second hour for Veterans Day on purpose, to update you on the archives, but today, as Dave has made abundantly clear, that this is the 100th anniversary of the Armistice. The war ended at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, as certainly my mother never retired of reminding me. World War I is no longer looms very large in our collective memory. But it was once the Great War, the war for democracy, the war to end all wars, a high cause. And we know now that it ushered in instead the calamities of the 20th century. So this morning we are not in any way celebrating World War I. If we did that, it would turn to ashes in our mouth very quickly. But it does help to remember. We call it Veterans Day. In England, they often called it Remembrance Day. And remembering that period, both in the life of our church and in our country, is one of the tasks of the Tiffany windows. America entered the war in April of 1917. It made a difference. It tilted the balance of the war. My grandfather was enlisted in 1915, August 1915, in the Australian Expeditionary Force. He served 30 months on the Western Front, first with the AEF and then with the British Field Survey Company. He wrote home often. I did a family history recently based on his letters. And one of them in July of 1917, looking for some positives in the middle of that horrible, horrible slog, was that the first American troops, he told his family in Australia, had just arrived. Most of the American troops did not arrive until a year later, in the summer of 1918, and that finally tilted the balance. Our Tiffany windows honor the 100 men and women of this church, associated with this church, who served either in the armed forces, the Army or the Navy, or in relief or welfare organizations during World War I. I don't know if you've made it up there to look at the inscriptions at the bottom of each window. The one on the left reads, "In recognition of those of this church who entered the service of their country in the Great War." The middle one reads, "In memory of those who made the supreme sacrifice," and the one on the right adds, "in commemoration of the high cause which they served." The windows were dedicated on Easter Sunday, April 4th, 1920. That's 18 months after the end of the war. They were made by Tiffany Studios in New York. That's why we call them the Tiffany windows. They were designed by Frederick Wilson, the head of Tiffany's ecclesiastical department. He was one of the leading stained glass designers of the time, born in Ireland actually, of English parents. Came to this country when he was 30 or 31, and just 4 years later had become the head of Tiffany Studios' ecclesiastical department. It's said that 20 artisans worked on these windows, both men and women, and that there are some 25,000 pieces of glass that have come together in the designs in the windows that are in front of you. This photo on the right, it's repeated in here if you cannot see it, is of the interior of the church after the windows were put in place. There was a center pulpit. The communion table was on the floor at the same level of the pews, different pews in those days, and the choir sat in a loft against the back wall facing the congregation. After the service, the members of the congregation, those who showed up that Sunday, gathered on the front lawn and they planted 3 memorial trees, 2 Japanese cryptomeria and 1 American white pine. They're still out there. And I think most of us didn't realize that they are a living memorial to the 3 members of this church who died in the service during World War I. Those 3 were, in the upper right, Ralph Hopkins, captain in the U.S. Army. He was a Harvard class of 1911, an investment banker, chose Montclair as a nice place to raise his family. That's perhaps still true 100 years later. He was very much a supporter of the preparedness movement, which was the elite on the East Coast disagreed with President Wilson's efforts to keep America out of the war. And he took part in the training at Plattsburgh, New York in 1916, if you know about that episode. He was in an officer's training course during the summer of 1917, ranked first in that course, so the Army put him to work training others. In the beginning of 1918 in Maryland, he got an acute throat infection and died of that disease in March of 1918. Will Galley, on the bottom there, a young man, grew up in Montclair. He enlisted in April 1918, a year after the start of the war. Training had picked up at that point, so he got to France fairly quickly. He was wounded at the Battle of the Argonne, that largest and bloodiest of the battles in which American forces took place. He was wounded on October 24th. He died of those wounds on November 4th, 1918, 1 week before the Armistice. In the upper right is Edmund Rapkin. Again, grew up in this church. His family lived in the Lucy Stone house here in Montclair. His father was the vice president of International Telephone and Telegraph. As a college freshman, he enlisted within a day or two of America entering the war. He had to come home in the winter of 1917 because he had an appendectomy. He probably returned too quickly, never fully recovered. He was racked by a lung infection, might have been sent home, but he insisted on continuing to stay in France. He died of that infection. It may well have been the influenza as well, on October 30th, 1918. And let me mention one more person, James Warren Beebe, who enlisted the same day in the same training course as Will Galley. Beebe was wounded in October 1918. He endured extended hospitalizations in France and in this country. He did not make his way back to Montclair until after the windows had been installed. He did live in Montclair for the next 25 or so years. Hopkins, Galley, and Rapkin are, of course, just three of the men from Montclair who died in the war. There are about 6 from Montclair who died. The Montclair Red Cross and the Montclair Victory Loan Committee collected the names as a roll of honor, sought photographs, 52 of them. They found 52 photographs for 52 of the men, and published this in the Montclair Times in April 1919. You can see in the upper right-hand corner Crawford Cruz, and you know that the African-American Legion post in Montclair is named for Crawford Cruz. There are World War I memorials throughout this town. Of course, the one at Edgemont Park, the flagpole in Watchung Plaza, the tower of St. James Church are windows. They're all part of a response of Montclair to the service in World War I. It's perhaps worth keeping in mind that our three are just 3 of the 60 from Montclair. The 60 from Montclair are a handful of the 100,000, 115,000 Americans who died in World War I, and that's just a very small fraction of the military deaths from the Allied and the Axis powers, about 8.5 million. It's almost unimaginable. And that 8.5 million does not count the 7 million civilians who were caught up in the war and died on the Western Front, the Eastern Front, or in the Middle East. So when the war ended, there was celebration and Thanksgiving. On the first Sunday after the Armistice, the 17th of November, this church joined with 3 other churches in Upper Montclair at 8 o'clock in the evening for a service of Thanksgiving with St. James and Upper Montclair Presbyterian, Montclair Heights Reformed. They had worked together for a few years in an interchurch forum. Then on Thanksgiving Day, in the afternoon, there was a service of Thanksgiving. Dr. Stocking, J.T. Stocking, who was then the minister, preached a sermon that he called "In the Day of Victory." Stocking was a good writer. He, Amherst grad who taught English at Lawrenceville School before deciding to enter the ministry. And in that sermon, which was printed and we found in the archives, he wrote, "This has been a war of ideals. On one side has been the gospel of Nietzsche, on the other, the gospel of Nazareth. On one side, the ideal of Superman, on the other, the ideal of the Christian man. On one side, the doctrine that the strong shall ride to power on the necks of the weak. On the other side, the doctrine that the strong shall get beneath the burdens of the weak. On the one side, the creed that might makes right. On the other side, the creed that right makes might." But even in these first days after the armistice, a different note, a more somber note was beginning to appear. Dr. Stocking ended his sermon with this: "My friends, there is another note that is running through our hearts today. It is the note of sorrow. Since we last met in celebration of the victory, we have come to know better the price that we have paid for it. The share of that price which Upper Montclair has borne has been very great." And at that point, I think the news of Will Galley's death had reached the congregation. But that note of sorrow only increased as more reports of the casualties filtered back to the States. This is the Newark Evening News of Wednesday, December 4th, 1918. The War Department had added another 1,732 people to the list, including Edmund Rapkin. His parents got a telegram, and they said, "It can't possibly be true. You're saying he died on a date, but we received a letter from him dated after that." The telegram was wrong, but not about the fact of his death, just the date of his death. And I find it rather touching that it was Edmund Rapkin's mother who gave the flowers at the dedication service for these windows in April 1920. So by the end of 1918, just 6 weeks later, after the Armistice, the focus had shifted from celebration and thanksgiving to one of memory and recognition of sacrifice. And this church held a service on the last Sunday of the year, December 29th, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Both Dr. Stocking and Union Bethel, a member of this church who was president of the New York Telephone Company, spoke at that service. The front of the bulletin says, "A service in memory of those who have given their lives for their country," listing Hopkins, Galley, and Rapkin, and in recognition of the sacrificial spirit of those whose names are on the church's roll of honor. And on page 4 of the bulletin was a list of 100 individuals, 93 men and 7 women. By the end of 1918, at the same time that service was taking, Dr. Stocking had formed a 7-member committee with the charge of investigating, quote, "some form of suitable memorial, 4 men, 3 women. The women, of course, identified by their husbands' names, as was the practice in that period. The committee was chaired by Frederick Herbert, an engineer. I think of him as the Armin Khachaturian of the day. He was clerk of the church's board of trustees, and thank goodness his correspondence file about this project was deposited in the archives, and that's why we have the Tiffany contract. That's why we have the correspondence with Tiffany Studios and such. Stanley Covert, who was then who was a church trustee and responsible for the buildings, also played a key role. And I might note Mrs. Charles G. Phillips. She had 2 sons who served, one an officer who was wounded in France. She was president of the Women's Missionary Society for 16 or 17 years. She must have been a force of nature. Her husband was a town commissioner, later mayor of Montclair. They lived directly across the street where P2 is now. They had a rather grand house that was later demolished. P2, of course, was moved from where the Vincent Building is now across the street to where the Phillips family lived. I don't. We'll keep looking for that. The committee quickly settled on the idea of installing new stained glass windows in these 3 openings. The openings were there. Frederick Herbert called the glass that was there atrocious, so I think there was a feeling that this was an opportunity to make things look a little better. The committee went to the congregation at the annual meeting in February with the proposal. It was approved. The Easter offering in 1919, a special offering, was to support, to raise monies for the memorial. They raised $3,600, which was in contributions and pledges. That was sufficiently close to the $5,000 they needed to move ahead. To put that in context, $5,000 in 1919 is the rough equivalent of about $75,000 today. I think we got a bargain. But it also perhaps shows how poorly remunerated labor was in those days. Also, put it in context, in 1920, the entire church budget was $20,000. Half for operations, half for benevolences and missions. Dr. Stocking's maxim was $1 for missions, for every dollar we raise for ourselves. The congregation also paid off the mortgage for the parsonage, and they raised additional funds for the renovation of the interior. They thought, if we're getting windows in here, we better clean it up a little bit. They asked Frederick Wilson of Tiffany and another church architecture firm for suggestions. They suggested a warm gray color to complement the windows. We don't have that anymore. They also considered expanding the size of this sanctuary. Two suggestions. One was to put a balcony around this that would add room for another maybe 100 people. That was turned down. The other idea, astonishingly, was to move this wall 17 feet back to the driveway. That was turned down as well. But on May 4th, with some money in hand, support of the congregation, Frederick Herbert and Stanley Covert met with Frederick Wilson. That's him as a somewhat younger man. And he discussed a preliminary design. The next day, Wilson wrote on the Tiffany stationery to Herbert. Let's see. Thank you for the sketch just received. I hope it did not put you to any inconvenience to send it, especially as I feel under so deep an obligation to you for a delightful day yesterday. I will pitch into the rearrangement of the window design and let you and Mr. Covert know when I ought to consult you again. With kindest regards, I am sincerely yours, Frederick Wilson. They wrote better letters in those days, I think. This is the contract, at least the one as proposed, and I suspect Wilson brought it with him on the 4th. It's for what he called 3 lights, the 3 openings there. If we had a Gothic window, he might well have tried one design that worked across the whole thing, but these openings are far enough apart that proposed instead separate scenes, all with the unifying theme of illustrating the spirit of sacrifice. Wilson called the individual scenes medallions. In any event, the contract was signed in June 1919. The original goal was to have them ready by the first Sunday after the anniversary of the Armistice in November. That deadline was not met. Tiffany Studios provided a description of the window. It's been used by the church in various ways over the years. I've drawn on an article in the Montclair Times from the day before the dedication. I feel that's probably closest to Tiffany's description. They indicated that the central theme is the consecration to ideals, of the willingness to sacrifice oneself for those ideals. And they intended it to be shown most vividly in that central panel, 4 up in the middle, of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Wilson wanted the deep blue and rich purple of Jesus' robes to draw your eye and focus your thoughts on his supreme sacrifice. Again, the Montclair Times reported that Tiffany said that each medallion was intended, quote, as a work of art in itself, a priceless gem in an exquisite setting. And as you know, the window on the left, those are 4 scenes from the Old Testament. Then in the middle, scenes from the ministry of Jesus, topped by a representation of the Ascension. And then on the right, 4 scenes from the early church. We've all looked at these windows over the months and over the years, and I suspect we each have our favorite. I really like the one second on the left, second from the bottom of Moses and the burning bush. Although the more I look at the bottom one of Abraham and Isaac, the more taken I am with that, with the fire ready for the sacrifice. And the ram, You have to go up close to see there's a ram caught in the thicket on the right side of that window. I suspect Frederick Wilson had the most fun designing the window of Gideon and his troops fighting the Midianites, 3 up from the bottom on the left. There are the trumpets that the soldiers are blowing, the camp fires are burning in the front, and the design even goes past the constraints of that rectangle as the sword goes in above. Wilson was known for his angel wings. He studied herons and cranes, and he really wanted them to be as naturalistic as possible. So I view the one of the top on the left of the Call of Isaiah with those angel wings almost as Wilson's signature, because I think that's where he got a chance to really use his skill in representing wings. In the center, we have the presentation of the young Jesus in the temple. Then with the baptism of Jesus, his feet are in the water there, with the baptism by John. Then Jesus washing the feet of the disciples, topped by Jesus in Gethsemane, and then the ascension. I find the two at the bottom fairly static and formal, not the most successful ones. But as I've been looking at them in recent weeks, I note that not only are the themes working vertically, but if you look chromatically on a horizontal basis, you see the bottom ones have this kind of deep rust robe, and this one's turned a little bit more red here, across the bottom. The ones second from the bottom have a greenish tone. If you look at the window at the bottom on the left and on the right, there's a semicircular design that is repeated. So Wilson is, I think, trying to tie them together horizontally as well as vertically. Then on the right, the stoning of Stephen, and actually I find the placement of the figures is very similar to the Abraham and Isaac scene. On top of that is the imprisonment of Peter, and then Paul before Agrippa, and then above that, I think another really lovely, lovely scene. That's the vision of John on Patmos of the holy city, the city of God. That's John of the Revelation of John. Whoops, that didn't come through very well. Again, it will much easier to read and hear then. The relationship with Tiffany grew a little testy as they kept missing deadlines. First goal was November of 1919, then it was Christmas of 1919, and then it finally shifted and they met by a few days, Easter of 1920. I suspect that Tiffany got an awful lot of commissions after the war, and they had a lot of work on their plate. What you can't see here is that when Frederick Herbert wrote to Wilson in early January, Wilson added a postscript, and it says, "We are working on the new chancel window with the intention of having it in place for Easter as promised." Both Dr. Stocking and the committee followed up in February to make sure they remained on track. They were getting pretty nervous. The other letter, which you can't read at all now, is that at the dedication, the response to the windows was perhaps not uniformly positive. There were some concerns raised. One about that the purple and the blue were in too striking contrast with the rest of the window. There were concerns about how green the lower part of the Isaiah window was, and some of that may have been caused that the protected glass was green on the outside. That's since been replaced. But Lucius Eastman, the president of the trustees, contacted Tiffany Studios. It must have been first thing the Monday morning after the dedication, because the same day Tiffany Studios responded reminding Mr. Eastman and the members of the church that the windows had been approved by the committee before installation, and that they should look at the contract under the special conditions clause, which is that any change to the design after installation would have to be personally approved by Lewis Comfort Tiffany, and there would be additional charges for that. In the end, the church settled for paying the final installment on the bill, and Frederick Herbert wrote a letter of, it must have been a fairly diplomatic letter, expressing such appreciation to Wilson for working with him, repeating some of the concerns and hoping that perhaps one day they might be addressed. So I think that part of the letter was more for members of the congregation than for Tiffany. So the final thing, and I'll close with this, the roll of honor. What the church decided to do was to publish a booklet, and it's called Our Record in the Great War. There are about 4 or 5 of these in the archives that we've come across. And I think they did a good job, because not just listing the names, they contacted each individual who had served. Again, in the relief and organizations as well as in the armed forces, and asked them about their experience. And they are in this booklet in fairly telegraphic form, just kind of a brief description what each individual did. If individual didn't respond, then they weren't included in this booklet. The introduction to Our Record in the Great War, I'm convinced was written by Dr. Stocking. And he reminded the members of the church then, and I think he challenges us now in what he wrote, and I would like to finish with that. His challenge to us is to summon in thought the stirring call to duty and the ready and loyal response, the dull routine of training and the active service in varied ways, and in many an instance, the dread reality of war, with all the darkness of combat and with all the glory of effort and sacrifice. Those days have now passed, and it remains for us who still live and who breathe the air of freedom and of privilege to dedicate ourselves to the cause of truth and justice in our own favored land and throughout the world. And he ends with Kipling's couplet, Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget. Thank you.